The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of the Martinez ranch, its rays creating waves of heat that danced above the barren pastures. Clara Martinez stood on the wooden porch of her adobe house, her calloused hands gripping the weathered railing as she surveyed what remained of her life's work. 3 months had passed since the accident that took her husband Miguel, and the drought that followed seemed determined to claim everything else she held dear. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm real sorry, but we can't extend that loan any further," said Benjamin Thompson, the banker from Santa Fe, as he adjusted his dust-covered hat. His voice carried the uncomfortable tone of a man delivering bad news he'd rather avoid. "The bank needs to see some kind of income, some sign this place can turn a profit." Clara's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Thompson, this ranch has been in my husband's family for 2 generations. We've survived Apache raids, floods, and 3 previous droughts. I'm not walking away now." The banker shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the empty cattle pens and the well that had run dry 2 weeks ago. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your husband knew these lands like no other man. You're just one woman trying to do the work of 10 men. "Then I'll learn to be worth 20, Clara replied, her dark eyes flashing with determination that made Thompson take a step back. After the banker's carriage disappeared into the shimmering distance, Clara walked through her property, taking inventory of what remained. The main house was solid. Miguel had built it to last, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool, even in the brutal heat. The barn needed repairs. Several fence posts had rotted and fallen, and the irrigation channels her husband had carefully constructed were now filled with sand and tumbleweeds. But it was the silence that hurt most. No longer did she hear Miguel's voice calling to the cattle. No longer did his laughter echo across the courtyard in the evenings. The ranch that had once buzzed with life now felt like a ghost town, inhabited only by her memories and stubborn hope. As evening approached, Clara sat on the same porch where she and Miguel used to plan their days, watching the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo mountains in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of New Mexico remained unchanged, but everything else felt broken beyond repair. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Opening Miguel's old journal, she began to read his careful notes about water sources, seasonal patterns, and the delicate balance required to make the harsh land yield life. If she was going to save this ranch, she would need to become the rancher Miguel had been, and perhaps something more. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Clara began her daily ritual of checking the property boundaries. It was on one of these early morning rides, 3 weeks after the banker's visit, that her life took an unexpected turn. She was following a game trail near the arroyo, hoping to find signs of an underground water source Miguel had mentioned in his journal, when her horse suddenly stopped and snorted nervously. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to her saddle, a habit born from years of frontier life. That's when she saw him. An Apache warrior sat motionless on his paint horse about 50 yards away, watching her with the intense focus of a man accustomed to reading danger in every detail. He appeared to be in his 30s, with shoulder-length black hair and traditional buckskin clothing that had seen better days. Most notably, Clara observed that his left arm hung at an awkward angle, clearly injured and poorly healed. The two regarded each other in silence for several heartbeats, each assessing the threat the other might represent. Clara had heard the stories. Everyone in New Mexico had. The Apache wars had officially ended, but tensions remained high, and encounters between settlers and Apache were still viewed with suspicion by both sides. "Your land," the warrior said finally, his English accented but clear, surprising Clara with his directness. "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My husband's family's land." "My husband dead," he observed, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Clara felt a flash of anger at his bluntness, but something in his tone, not mockery but perhaps understanding, made her pause. "Yes." 3 months ago. The Apache nodded slowly. Water, he said, pointing toward the arroyo with his good arm. Your husband knew, you do not. Clara's eyebrows rose. You knew Miguel. Saw him many times. He understood the land speaks, listened to water beneath sand. The warrior's horse shifted restlessly, but he controlled it with subtle movements. You will lose everything. Land will take it back. The harsh truth of his words stung, because Clara recognized them as accurate. She was fighting a losing battle against drought, debt, and her own inexperience. But instead of yielding to despair, she found herself curious about this man who spoke of her husband with apparent respect. "And you?" she asked boldly. "What happened to your arm?" The Apache's face darkened, and for a moment Clara thought he might ride away without answering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. Cavalry patrol. They said peace, but brought war. Lost arm, lost family, lost home. He looked directly at her then, and Clara saw something in his eyes she recognized. The same stubborn refusal to surrender that she felt every morning when she woke up in an empty house. "I am Ayana," he said, using the Apache word that meant eternal blossom. Then, as if translating for her benefit, he added, "Joseph to white man's tongue." "Clara," she replied simply. Joseph studied her for another long moment, then made a decision that surprised them both. "Water is 3 feet down, 20 paces south of Twisted Mesquite. Husband's journal tells you how to dig." Before Clara could respond, he wheeled his horse around and cantered away, leaving her alone with a piece of information that might save her ranch, and 1,000 questions about why an Apache warrior would help the widow of a white rancher. That evening, Clara found the twisted mesquite tree Joseph had mentioned and located Miguel's notes about the underground spring. As she planned the work ahead, she couldn't shake the memory of the understanding she'd seen in the Apache's eyes, or the way he'd spoken of loss with the same quiet dignity she was trying so hard to maintain. The well digging began at dawn the next day. Clara had read Miguel's instructions a dozen times, studied his crude map of the underground water flow, and gathered every tool she could find. What she hadn't anticipated was how physically demanding the work would be, or how her untrained hands would blister and bleed within the first hour. She was 3 feet down, sweat streaming down her face despite the early hour, when a shadow fell across the hole. Looking up, she saw Joseph sitting on his horse, watching her struggle with what might have been amusement. "White woman digs like prairie dog," he observed. "Much noise, little progress." Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of mud across her face. "If you're here to mock my efforts, you can move along. I don't need an audience." To her surprise, Joseph dismounted and approached the edge of the hole. "Show me husband's marks," he said, extending his good hand. Clara hesitated, then handed up Miguel's journal. Joseph studied the pages with the intensity of a man reading sacred text, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of recognition. "Miguel Goodman," he said finally. "Understood Apache knowledge, white man tools. This," he tapped the journal, "this is wisdom." "Then why are you helping me?" Clara asked, genuinely confused. "Your people and mine haven't exactly been friendly." Joseph was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "My daughter loved horses, 7 winters old, fast like desert wind." His voice grew softer. "Day soldiers came, she hid in corral. Horses ran, trampled her trying to escape bullets." He looked down at Clara, and she saw the grief that lived behind his stoic exterior. "Your husband, Miguel, he found her after, buried her proper Apache way, sang right songs." Clara felt her breath catch. Miguel had never mentioned this encounter, but it explained so much about the respectful way he'd always spoken of the Apache and why he'd insisted on learning some of their language and customs. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Good men help when help needed," Joseph said simply. "Miguel helped my heart carry weight. Now his woman needs help carrying different weight." From that day forward, an unlikely partnership began to take shape. Joseph appeared each morning just after sunrise, bringing with him knowledge of the land that complemented Miguel's written instructions. He showed Clara how to read the color of the soil, to judge its moisture, how to construct irrigation channels that worked with the natural flow of the terrain rather than against it, and how to identify which plants indicated underground water sources. In return, Clara shared her husband's innovations, metal tools that made certain jobs easier, techniques for preserving water during the driest months, and the Spanish words Miguel had learned from his father for different types of soil and weather patterns. The work was backbreaking, but gradually the ranch began to show signs of life. The well they dug together produced sweet, clean water. The irrigation channels they carved and lined with stones brought that precious resource to areas that hadn't seen moisture in months. Clara's hands grew calloused and strong, and her understanding of the land deepened with each passing day. But perhaps more importantly, both Clara and Joseph began to heal from wounds that went deeper than drought or injured limbs. In the shared struggle to bring life back to the desert, they found something neither had expected to discover again: hope and the beginning of trust that transcended the bitter history between their peoples. The transformation wasn't just in the land, but in themselves. Clara discovered reserves of strength and knowledge she hadn't known she possessed, while Joseph found purpose beyond the anger and loss that had consumed him since the cavalry attack. Together, they were proving that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from building something new and meaningful from its ashes. 6 months after their first encounter, the Martinez ranch was unrecognizable. Green shoots of grass had emerged in the previously barren pastures. The irrigation system channeled precious water to every corner of the property, and a small herd of cattle grazed contentedly in the shade of the cottonwood trees that had finally leafed out. But the changes went far deeper than what could be seen from the surface. Clara stood in her kitchen, preparing a meal that had become their daily tradition. Coffee brewed strong the way Miguel had liked it, bread baked in the adobe horno behind the house, and whatever game Joseph had managed to hunt with his good arm. Their conversations had evolved from basic communication about water and soil to deeper discussions about life, loss, and the future they were building together. "Bankman comes again tomorrow," Clara said as she placed the food on the rough wooden table. "Mr. Thompson sent word. He wants to inspect the property." Joseph nodded, testing the mobility in his left arm. Clara's insistence that he see the doctor in Santa Fe had paid off. The arm would never be fully functional, but careful exercises and proper care had restored much of his strength. Land speaks truth now. Even white banker cannot ignore green grass and full well. "But there's something else," Clara continued, her voice growing more serious. "People in town are talking about us working together. Some of them," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "some of them think it's not proper." Joseph's expression darkened. "You want me to leave?" "No!" Clara's response was immediate and fierce. "That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that if we're going to continue this partnership, we need to be prepared for the challenges that will bring." She reached across the table and touched his scarred hand with her own work-roughened fingers. "Joseph, this ranch would have died without your help. I would have lost everything. But more than that, you've given me back something I thought was gone forever: hope for the future." Joseph looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. Apache way says land belongs to all people. White man's law says land belongs to one person. Your way or mine. Clara smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached all the way to her eyes. What if we found a third way? What if we showed them it could be both? The next day, Benjamin Thompson arrived with a different expression than he'd worn during his previous visit. The evidence of the ranch's recovery was impossible to deny. Healthy cattle, flowing water, and fields that showed every sign of successful cultivation. "Mrs. Martinez, he said, removing his hat as he approached the porch where Clara waited, I have to admit, I didn't expect to see this kind of progress. The land needed someone who understood it, Clara replied simply. Fortunately, I found the right teacher. Thompson's gaze shifted to where Joseph was working on fence repairs, his movements efficient despite his injured arm. Ma'am, I have to ask about your employment situation. There's been talk. Mr. Thompson, Clara interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed over months of hard decisions. This ranch is profitable again. My loan payments will be current starting next month. What matters is that the land is productive and the debts are being paid. The banker studied her face for a long moment, recognizing something that hadn't been there during his previous visit. Confidence born from genuine achievement. Yes, ma'am. I suppose that is what matters. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple, Clara and Joseph reflected on how far they'd traveled together. Miguel would be proud, Joseph said quietly. He planted seeds of respect. We grew them into something strong. Clara nodded, thinking of her husband's journal and the wisdom it contained. Not just about ranching, but about seeing beyond surface differences to recognize the humanity in others. You know, I think this is what he always envisioned for this place. Not just a ranch, but proof that different ways of knowing can work together. As the stars emerged in the vast New Mexico sky, neither Clara nor Joseph could have predicted where their unlikely partnership would lead. But they had learned that sometimes the strongest foundations are built not on avoiding hardship, but on facing it together, combining different strengths to create something neither could have achieved alone. The ranch that had nearly died from drought and neglect was now thriving, but more importantly, two people who had lost almost everything had found a way to rebuild not just land and cattle, but hope itself. In a territory where cultural divides seemed insurmountable, they had proven that understanding, respect, and shared purpose could bridge even the deepest differences. And in the desert of New Mexico, where survival had always depended on reading the subtle signs of the land and sky, Clara Martinez and Joseph had learned to read the signs in each other's hearts, finding there the courage to build a future that honored both their pasts while creating something entirely new. 2 years had passed since Benjamin Thompson first witnessed the transformation of the Martinez Ranch, and the changes continued to ripple through the territory like water spreading across thirsty desert ground. What had begun as a desperate woman's fight for survival had evolved into something far more significant. A living example of what cooperation could achieve in a land torn by decades of conflict. Clara stood in the expanded barn, watching Joseph demonstrate proper horse training techniques to young Timothy Morrison, the 17-year-old son of a neighboring rancher. The boy's father had been skeptical about sending his son to learn from an Apache, but the reputation of the Martinez Ranch had grown too impressive to ignore. Their horses were the finest in 3 counties, their cattle the healthiest, and their water management system had become the model that other struggling ranchers desperately wanted to replicate. "Feel the horse's spirit," Joseph was saying, his English now fluent after 2 years of daily conversation with Clara and the increasing number of visitors to their ranch. "Do not break it, guide it. Horse chooses to trust you or chooses to fight. Better to earn trust." Timothy nodded eagerly, his initial nervousness around Joseph having evaporated within the first week of lessons. Clara smiled, remembering her own first encounter with this man who had seemed so intimidating from across that dusty arroyo. Now she knew Joseph's gentle laugh, his careful attention to injured animals, and his patient way of explaining complex concepts about land management that had taken generations of Apache knowledge to develop. The sound of approaching horses drew Clara outside, where she saw Father Miguel Santos dismounting from his mare. The elderly priest had become a regular visitor, initially coming to check on Clara's spiritual well-being as a widow, but increasingly drawn by the theological questions raised by the partnership between Clara and Joseph. "Buenos dias, Clara," Father Santos called, his weathered face creasing into a familiar smile. "I bring news from Santa Fe." Clara wiped her hands on her work apron and approached the priest. Over the months, their conversations had evolved beyond simple pastoral visits into deeper discussions about community, healing, and the practical application of Christian charity in a land where cultural wounds ran deep. "The territorial governor has been asking questions about your ranch," Father Santos continued, his tone suggesting news of some importance. "It seems your success has reached official ears. There's talk of bringing a delegation here to study your methods." Joseph emerged from the barn, Timothy close behind. The young man's comfort around the Apache warrior would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier, but now seemed as natural as the desert sunrise. "More visitors," Joseph observed with wry amusement. "Soon we need bigger kitchen." Clara laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as her grief transformed into something more complex. A deep appreciation for Miguel's memory combined with gratitude for the unexpected life she'd built since his death. "What kind of delegation, Father?" "Agricultural experts, water engineers, and—" The priest paused meaningfully. "Representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It seems your partnership has raised questions about possibilities for cooperation that hadn't been previously considered." The implications hung in the desert air like heat waves. For decades, official government policy had focused on separation, assimilation, or conflict. The idea that Apache knowledge and Anglo determination could create something mutually beneficial challenged fundamental assumptions about how different cultures could coexist. That evening, after Timothy had ridden home and Father Santos had continued on his circuit, Clara and Joseph sat on their usual spot on the porch, discussing what the priest's news might mean for their future. "You worried," Joseph observed, noting the tension in Clara's shoulders. "Aren't you?" Clara asked. "We've built something good here, something that works. What if outside attention ruins it?" Joseph was quiet for several minutes, watching the familiar play of shadows across the landscape they had learned to read together like a beloved book. "Apache story," he said finally. "Coyote plants corn in secret place, keeps it hidden, corn grows strong. One day, drought comes to all the land. Coyote must choose. Keep corn hidden and safe, or share with hungry people and risk losing everything." Clara waited, understanding that Joseph's stories always carried deeper meanings. Coyote shares corn. Some people grateful, tend plants with care. Others take too much, damage some plants. But seeds spread. Next year, corn grows in many places. Even when drought comes again, people remember how to plant, how to tend, how to share. The wisdom in the story settled over Clara like a familiar blanket. Their ranch had become more than just a successful agricultural venture. It had become proof that cooperation was possible, that ancient knowledge and new techniques could combine to create abundance even in harsh conditions. Miguel used to say that the best ranchers aren't the ones who can make the land yield the most, but the ones who can help the land give what it's meant to give, Clara said softly. "Maybe that's true for people too." Joseph nodded. "Your husband, wise man, saw what could grow, not just what was already there." As autumn approached, the delegation Father Santos had mentioned arrived, a mix of government officials, university researchers, and curious ranchers from across the territory. For a week, they studied the irrigation systems, interviewed both Clara and Joseph extensively, and observed the daily operations of a ranch that had achieved what many considered impossible. Dr. William Henderson, an agricultural scientist from the University of Colorado, was particularly intrigued by the integration of Apache water-finding techniques with European-style cultivation methods. "Mrs. Martinez," he said on the final day of his visit, "what you and Joseph have accomplished here represents an entirely new approach to desert agriculture. Have you considered documenting these methods for wider distribution? Clara looked across the thriving fields toward where Joseph was demonstrating traditional plant selection techniques to a group of visiting ranchers. Some of these men had fought against the Apache just years earlier, but now they listened intently, taking careful notes about seasonal timing and soil preparation. "Dr. Henderson," Clara replied, "the most important thing we've learned here isn't really about irrigation or cattle breeding. It's about listening. The land teaches you what it needs, but only if you're willing to learn its language. Joseph taught me that Miguel's knowledge and Apache wisdom weren't competing ideas. They were different words for the same truth." The delegation's report would eventually influence territorial policy regarding cooperation between Anglo settlers and Indian communities. But for Clara and Joseph, the immediate result was simpler and more profound. They had proven to themselves and their community that healing was possible, that loss could be transformed into growth, and that the strongest partnerships often formed between people who had survived the worst that life could offer. As winter settled over the ranch that first year, after the delegation's visit, Clara found herself pregnant, a development that surprised everyone, including herself and Joseph, whose quiet courtship had evolved so naturally that neither could pinpoint exactly when their partnership had deepened into love. Their son, born the following spring and named Miguel Josef Martinez, would grow up bilingual and bicultural, as comfortable tracking game through the desert as he was working cattle in the corrals. More importantly, he would grow up in a world where cooperation between different peoples wasn't just possible, but practical and profitable. Standing on the same porch, where she had once contemplated losing everything, Clara now watched her husband teach their 3-year-old son how to read the evening sky for signs of tomorrow's weather. The ranch stretched around them, green and prosperous, home to not just cattle and horses, but to an idea that had taken root in the harsh desert soil and grown into something beautiful and enduring. The Martinez Ranch had indeed become what Miguel had always envisioned, proof that the American frontier could be a place where different traditions strengthened each other rather than competing for dominance. In rebuilding her ranch, Clara had helped rebuild hope itself, creating a legacy that would influence how future generations approached the challenges of living together in a diverse and demanding land.